So thank you everybody for coming and turning out on a warmer night that many of us would want to go for a walk or do some gardening. So thank you for taking your time out to come and listen to me. The title of the talk, an Edwardian Lakeland tour. These were organised by the Furness Railway, and we shall follow the path of one, although most of the photographs were not taken in Furness Railway days. They date from the late 1860s up to as recent as 2006. We will be going, everywhere we go, you will be on the tour. Now, at the back of the rail motor on this title slide, note a signal box. We will be seeing it later in the presentation at its where it went to after it left the station site. So red engines and blue carriages, that will come up again later. Here we see the red engine that all Furness Railway engines were painted in, and the earlier blue and white colour scheme for carriages, replaced by plain overall blue after the First World War. Furness Railway, not the line from Carnforth to Whitehaven it is now, with only a couple of short stub branches. The line started off 1846 to bring, as a purely local line, to bring slate from Kirby and iron ore from near Dalton down to the coast at Barrow and Roe Island, which was called Peel in those days. Only a short part of the line showing on the slide remains today, which has been absorbed into the current Furness main line. Headhunters, haven't we heard of them before? Yes. Alfred Aslett, the general manager appointed late 1895. He came when the fortunes of the railway were on the decline. The line had been built for the carriage of minerals, and frankly, passengers were a nuisance. And at times, they even suspended the passenger service to get more mineral trains running. He replaced the previous general manager, Sir James Ramsden, who had been there almost from the start, as had most of the senior officers. So as the generation retired, a new generation came in, and the directors appointed a committee to recommend who to appoint. We've seen it all before, and we'll see other things that we've seen before today as we go along. They recommended a young, energetic man, Alfred Aslett, at that time general manager of the Cambrian Railway in Wales, a line with similar problems. His job was to increase the passenger traffic, and he was also an extremely good cost cutter. Furness Railway expenses were amongst the lowest in the country. So here we see his portrait picture when he was taken when he went on holiday to New York, and his signature that you see all over Furness documents. Now we've gone for our holiday to Blackpool. Why start at Blackpool? We'll see in a minute. The Furness Railway, through Mr. Aslett's energy, organised a series of tours in the Lake District, all to increase the passenger traffic. So a handcart was pushed round Blackpool with leaflet racks, pictures of where you were going to see, and one of their magnificent award-winning posters, produced as a set of postcards in 1914. Thankfully, some of these images survive as colour that would not otherwise have done. This is the one that was on the handcart. We're intrigued, So we get our leaflet and we book our tour. Publicity, very publicity conscious. Big stands at the big international exhibitions in London. And it was even taken to Brussels, where unfortunately it was destroyed by fire and never replaced. You could get copies of the publications, the timetables, list of hotels, all sorts were produced. All you did was you sent this postcard in and asked for what you wanted. But note, they made you pay for the stamp. Using old postcards of old unsold stock, of course. Never want to waste anything. Appointed late 1895, the first programme was ready by 1897 for the summer season. And the illustrated guides were produced every year up to 1922, when the Furness merged at the end of the year into the LMS. And I've even only this last week seen the first LMS guide for 1923 was just a Furness one with an LMS cover on. So where are we going to go? We're going to start off at Blackpool at the bottom of the map, where we go by rail to Fleetwood, across the bay steamer to Barrow, where we catch a train up to Lakeside, catch the steamer, all owned by the company, everything owned by the company so far, up to Ambleside, where a private coach contractor would take us up to Coniston, ready for us to catch the 6 o'clock train back to Ramsden Dock at Barrow, and then across the bay to Fleetwood, and we arrive back in Blackpool exhausted after almost a 12-hour day. And what do we charge for this tour? The grand total of 7 shillings and sixpence, which for those of us today is 37.5 pence. But we must remember, in those days, a decent wage was £1 a week. So in relative times, still not cheap. So we join our excursion at the excursion platforms at Talbot Road Station, Blackpool, where we join a train up to Fleetwood. We buy our tickets, first class, third class as well. I don't have a ticket from Blackpool. I've never seen one yet, but the same tour was available without the steamer to Fleetwood part, and tickets were produced for it from most of the stations on the line. The first class one at the top is from Haverthwaite, was issued at Haverthwaite, and the bottom one from Lakeside. Notice the relative number of tickets from different stations, and you could go on the tour on a clockwise tour or an anti-clockwise. But for our purposes, we're going anti-clockwise today. So we join the boat. Here's the Assistant Harbour Master's office with the station behind. And in earlier days, up to 1905, when she was sold to the Admiralty for 12,000 quid, replaced by a steamer costing 5,000, cost cutting. But it didn't work because the new steamer only lasted a couple of years. But we have to remember the Furness reached its low ebb financially, 1904 and 5, and only an astute London banker basically saved them from going bust. So, of course, you realise all the capital you can. Lady Evelyn, built in 1900, she ran until the First World War, when she was requisitioned for mine clearance work. Returning to Barrow, the Cross Bay tours were never resumed, and she was sold to the South Coast, where she became the Brighton Belle. Sadly, lost at Dunkirk. 1903, the traffic was growing so well that they took her into dry dock at Barrow, where the Dock Museum now is. They cut her in half, added another 30 feet to her, and extended the upper deck. The steamer that replaced the Lady Margaret, Philomel, or more better known locally as Philosmel. She was rather dirty. Built 7 or 8 years before the Lady Margaret, she only lasted till the 1908 season, when she needed new boilers, which were going to cost more than she was worth, so she quietly went. Replaced by the Lady Moira, purchased second-hand from the Barrow Railway. Quite a lot can be said about that. The biggest capacity vessel the Furness had, being licensed for over 1,000 passengers. While we're on our crossing, we may be entertained by the band. They had a band for the two vessels. People weren't always on, all in Furness-style uniforms, and here they are playing for us. Now, a little enterprise locally, one of the local photographers, Edward Sankey, his collection of negatives, many of them have survived and are the subject of a heritage lottery funded project to conserve, catalogue, describe, and will be going in the Barrow archives with the negatives into long-term storage at Carlisle. What he did was, he had an arrangement with the Furness Railway that he would go out on the morning vessel, take pictures of the tourists as they were on the way back, and then he would be busy in his dark room during the day, and then he would be out on the evening return vessel selling you pictures. And it's surprising how many of these cards have survived. So there must have been thousands done, because I've yet to see the same one twice. But if you were one of the upper crust, you could have your picture taken with the captain on the bridge, as we see. Some of the pictures, you can work out where they were taken, like the one on the top right. And others show architectural features, as well as just massive numbers of people. On one occasion, he's taken 54 pictures. 54 is the highest number on a day I've seen. So quite a lot of work, but the negatives haven't survived because they were, to get them printed and back out in time, the fixing was done with meths. So a couple of days later, they would just be blank sheets of glass, unfortunately. But made himself quite a successful business and quite a good name out of it. We arrive at Ramsden Dock Station, Barrow, where we disembark. Here the station's seen after its 1885 rebuild, and one of the steamers for either the Isle of Man or Belfast waiting alongside. This picture's thought to have been taken late 1880s, early 1890s. Where we disembark into the shed with the overall roof, and never want to miss a trick, make a sale. A refreshment room was even provided. Contractors running things for the railway, haven't we heard of it before? Privatisation of British Rail. Yes, the catering was let out to contract, Spears and Pond of London. I don't know the financial arrangements, so as the contract lasted quite a while until given up in the war years, must have been mutually benefiting both parties. 1899, the directors ordered a new saloon. Rarely used, but it was available for private hire, and you could add it to your train for the tour if you wished by buying 12 first-class tickets and then a supplement of 5 shillings. Remember the basic tours 7 and 6, you can ride in this magnificent saloon, used as the carriage for minor royalty, and was last heard of in the 1930s as a grounded body at Crewe. So sadly, and inevitably it hasn't survived. I'm told that early in 1923, that and the rest of the saloon vehicles were taken out of the shed at Barrow, taken away, not to be seen again. But it does appear in the 1933 LMS carriage book. Aslett quickly invested some of the company's remaining capital in new engines, new carriages to enhance the experience of the new passengers he was working hard to attract. Here we see the new train, early 1900s, produced as a postcard by the company, sold in sets of 6. But whereas some companies gave away the postcards for publicity, not Mr. Aslett. You had to pay. The grand sum of 4p for 6 cards in an envelope in this case. We go through the docks at Barrow, the docks with a tail that wagged the dog, the tail wagging the dog of the Furness Railway, but without them, there would have been no railway. Here we see, in the 1950s, the liner, P&O liner or Sovo, going out for trials after being finished at Barrow. We cross the dock entrance onto the mainland from Barrow Island by this huge bridge known as the Cradle Bridge, the Schertzer rolling bridge. The hull of Hermes is to the right, sadly recently scrapped in India after over 50 years service and laid down at the end of the Second War and only launched because the berth was needed for the P&O liners. We passed the shed at Barrow with slightly more modern motive power in the 1950s, and inside the works at Barrow, a small works but highly competent in the day. Decent equipment, the wheel drops, carriage paint shops, had its own foundry. They could do nearly anything in-house. Here we see a train ready in the yard being prepared for Royal Train duty when the carriage we saw earlier was hauled from Heversham, a little station on one of the branches which we won't be covering, to Barrow to open a church bazaar. And they spent 60 quid on decorations for the event. So we joined the Furness main line at Salthouse Junction, now just a ground frame on the remaining stub into Barrow Docks, that this mineral train is coming from. The lines in front of us have gone. The main line goes to the right behind the locomotive, and we're on the Furness main line now to Ulverston and later Lakeside. Hardly, not a lot changed. The signal box from 1898 lasted till 1992. Signals have been replaced by upper quadrant, more modern loco, more modern wagons, but hardly altered from Furness days. And even into the 1950s and early 60s, it wasn't passengers that paid the bills, it was freight. Passengers were just a little bit of cream in a good year. Here we see the inside of the box in its last week of existence, sadly down at heel. And the first mainline station we pass is a small one, now an unmanned halt at Roos. Everything here, except for the platforms and the rails, has changed from this 1960s view. All the factories are now housing, bus shelters replace the station buildings. You can't take this picture for trees when I tried to do a then and now on it. Even the DMUs have been replaced twice. And on to the next station at Furness Abbey, very much a jewel in the company's crown. Beautiful, beautifully maintained, beautifully built, designed by high quality architects and built in high quality materials. I'm told that the station master here had a top hat. The only one on the furnace, and I'm told, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, because I like to learn, that only Euston and Keswick station masters normally had top hats besides on the LMS. Here we are light for the Furness Abbey Hotel, very much a jewel in the company's crown, ran in latter years by Spears and Pond. Here we see it at its full extent in the late 1860s. Started off as a manor house sold at the dissolution of the Abbey next door, and extended by the company till no sign of the medieval basically remained other than some of the walls. Everything was changed. And the far extension and tower being the last bit to be built. The big fire in 1896 there. And in the advertising, after it was reopened, they were making a big fuss of that they had electric lighting throughout. Imagine somewhere without it today. But of course, in those days, a new innovation. It had 36 bedrooms because they'd at that stage refurbished it and expanded it with rooms in the attic that we can see the dormers of. I can't ask you direct as I normally do on a live presentation, but how many bathrooms do you think were provided for these 36 bedrooms? I'll tell you, it was 3. And that was considered a feature to advertise. Inside, sumptuous, magnificently presented. This is just one of the rooms. Again, shown on one of the Furness Company's postcards. They provided you with correspondence cards if you were staying there. Of course, another way of them advertising themselves at low cost. And each room had its own room tag. And one of the only 2 I'm aware of surviving is shown below the card. The nearby Abbey, Furness Abbey, maintained at that time by the Furness Railway Company, owned by the chairman of the company, the Duke of Devonshire. So the guide was provided by the company, often an older employer who had had an accident at work. So it was a way of finding light duties for somebody who, through no fault of their own, were unable to do their own job. And the Furness were pretty good at that. They would find weighing, shelter jobs, wherever, provided with a station master's uniform. Here we see the gentleman in his uniform. Again, the company sold postcards of the Abbey. Happily still with us after a multi-million pound has been spent on it stabilising the structure in recent years. And the station we saw before closed and demolished in the early 1950s. By 1956, the tunnel needed relining. So no blockade for 12 months as it would have been today. Instead, they provided a temporary signal box, the original having long gone. They interlaced the track through the tunnel, and apart from a few hours through the night, the trains ran as normal through the tunnel with the short length of effectively single line, and while work was going on either side, and the crown would be done in overnight. Pictures exist of the vehicle that was concerned. And we leave Furness Abbey, and this 1897 or 8 view, I could talk all night on this, but the feature we want to look at is the signal box in the far background, octagonal in shape. Nobody thought we would ever going to see a picture of it until until it appeared on the end of a short piece of film. O.S. Knock, in one of his books, talks about it, saying he wished he'd taken a picture of it instead of one of the trains. So we know the date by the box is still open because it closed in December 1898 and remained as a ground frame until 1940 for a siding. And on to Dalton. Here we see it after extensions were made in the First World War to accommodate longer trains for munition workers to Barrow. Sorry, the bay on the right we're going to see in a minute, the yard behind. Oh dear, we've had a smashing time. In fact, it happened twice. That in a shunting accident, on a very steep gradient, a train ran away. This time around 1908, a quick thinking signalman, once again, after the first time, diverted the runaway into the bay platform we saw before. The accident happened about 10 o'clock. And what time do you think the main line was running again? 2:30. And on the first occasion, 1898, Mr. Aslet awarded the signalman 20 shillings for his promptness and foresight. That at the time was more than a week's wages. So clearly the man's work has been valued. Unfortunately, only a negative has survived of this letter. And we travel right up the top of the incline and we enter at 1/4 of a mile long, the longest tunnel on the Furness Railway proper. Whitehaven is longer, but that was joined with elsewhere. Seen here after it had been double tracked in the 1850s, but before the portal was taken off in 2006 during a blockade. Interesting story, this tunnel. Built a single track. When it was doubled, they built a new tunnel while trains continued to run through the old. The last job being the demolition of the lining. And the Institution of Civil Engineers have published a paper on the job. It was so significant. And to the right, we see photos of the portal we saw being removed. Needed to stabilise the land above it. And into Lindell Station. Long gone, another 1950s closure. But although the footbridge still survives today at Kirby, which we'll see later on. Lindell Ore sidings, principal marshalling yard of the furnace. 8-9 sidings wide, double main line loops through the middle. Controlled for many years by 2 signal boxes. Come 1939, the LMS were fed up of paying the 2 lots, so they modernised it, combined the 2 boxes in one, which was happening all over then, and of course continues to this day. But to do so and retain the loops, the loops at the east end were too far away to work by rods, so the not used very often continental system of wire-worked points was introduced. And if you wanted, I started on the railway in 1986, the box closed 78. And if you wanted to hear the older men some foul language, you would ask them about the wire-worked points at Lindell. Apparently, let's be kind and say they wouldn't have passed health and safety standards today, and rightly so. And oh dear, we've lost our train. 1892, engine sinks into the ground. Estimates are between 60 and 200 feet how deep the engine is. They went away for lunch while trying to recover it, having unhooked the tender. The engine sank, leaving just the tender and the train to be hauled away. And it was some months before normal service resumed again. Trains were diverted via the Cockermouth-Keswick line and other routes. And at the first, passengers got off at Lindell and went by road to Ulverston. Then they would walk round the far sidings, and latterly a train would go over at 5 miles an hour over the siding furthest away. And about 8 months later, the main line was restored. And on to Ulverston Station. Magnificent station, most of which, apart from the canopies being shortened, is still with us today. Island platform, that was for the Lakeside branch. The Lakeside branch train would come into the far platform, run round its train using the lines we see here, hook on the other end and back. And to avoid everybody having to go through the subway, island platform was provided and anyone from Barrow could get off. Here we see our train for Lakeside departing at the East End. 2 boxes there, now there's only 1. We pass one of the other main junctions of the Furness, Plumpton Junction, and on the right is a trip train for Lakeside. A train on the left has brought traffic up the branch from Glaxo, the big chemical works. So a scene, all that's left today is 2 plain lines, the box having gone in 2000. And on to our first train on the Lakeside branch, the trip train we see again at Greenodd. Still double track through the station, and it's single track beyond. And in the winter, the river was in harder winters than ours. The viaduct across the river was known to completely freeze. Here we see the big freeze of 1895, which we'll see again, the viaduct frozen in it. And onto the headquarters of the present Lakeside and Haverthwaite Railway at Haverthwaite, where our trip train is doing its shunting. One happy for 10 days in 1996 for the 150th anniversary of the Furness Railway. The National Railway Museum very kindly loaned Copperknob to be the star attraction. Sat outside Barrow Station to start with on a low loader, then in Ulverston. Plenty of traffic jams caused. In one stage, she was impounded by the police at York. More of that can come another time. And of course, she was brought out one Saturday after the service had finished and came out for a photographic session. And it's amazing what a smoke bomb does. The oldest ironworks in the world when it closed, 1967. And the reason for the Lakeside branch surviving for freight-only traffic after the closure to passengers in 65, taken here immediately after closure. Sadly, very little remains. And we reach our Lakeside where we join the steamer. Here we see the Furness Railway built steamer turn on out of the water for its annual maintenance. The station layout, most of which remained intact till the latter years, except that coal dumps were replaced by diesel tanks, this sort of thing, and the engine shed's gone. Here we join our steamer for Ambleside, refreshment room and pavilion. The track's down the quayside, narrow gauge, so that at the end of traffic, coal was put into little tubs which were wheeled, we think, by hand for coaling the steamers, until the 50s when the remaining steamers were converted to diesel power. 1895, we see our lake frozen with skating on it. Hard frozen as well. It must have happened a few times, as the Furness Railway even produced a postcard for it as one of their sets of 6. On our way to Bowness and Ambleside, the 2 remaining piers today, there were further piers, and we see a small one here where the Windermere ferry is now, and you could call the steamer to stop by putting the signal down on the pier. It then would know there was somebody waiting for it. And on to Bowness. Here we see an 1868 built vessel, lasted till the 1930s, the Swan. And while much behind has changed, a lot is still very similar. The church is still there, the Old England Hotel, much expanded, still there, and happily the Furness Railway pier buildings survive and are well maintained. Goods traffic went round the railway, went round the lake. Here we see the Furness Railway steamer, Raven, provided for the purpose. Grand days out, August 1896, the Viceroy of China, on the British part of his world tour, came to the Furness and was put up at the Abbey Hotel for 4 nights. On the spare, there he was taken to look at the different industries of Barrow, with a view to try and sell him some ships, sell him some steel, and whatever. And on the one day off, on the Sunday, a train was provided to take him for a tour of the lake. Here we see Mr. Aslett, many of the directors of the company, and others, special guests. He got off at Bowness, where he met delegations from other industries and people at the nearby hotel. A special programme was provided for the event, all gold leaf, no expense spared. The town put him up, the town hall put him up for a special dinner, everything. But I've yet to find an order that the town got. Again, if somebody knows otherwise, please tell me. And oh dear, accidents happen. The Swan aground, soon refloated and taken away. She sank in another accident and was raised. And I'm told the report is the sort of length you would expect today. I've yet to see it, but somebody told me it's 500 pages long. So they still like the bureaucracy. 2 of the steamers, both built 1879, passing each other. Would we like to be on those crowded steamers today? They were all packed, but notice very few on the front, where the first class section was. And we arrive at the head of the lake, 1996, at Ambleside, a scene virtually unchanged from Furness Railways till today. Here we get on our privately run coach, and the right-hand stub of our tickets would be taken off us so that the coachman could claim the fares off the railway company, where we would go to Coniston. This is one of the scenes we passed on the way. Mr. Sankey, always looking for an opportunity. He rebranded some quite ordinary postcards to us through Lakeland, and they were sold on the nearest station by booksellers or others. These cards are very hard to find today, and the highest number we've seen is 157, and there's so few of them around, we only know what something like half of them were. So another opportunity for Mr. Sankey, and those who are aware of the Sankey collection will know that it stayed in business, and they were still taking photographs on the half plate and printing them in-house up to when the business closed in 1970. And by a miracle, much of the collection survives for our enjoyment today. There is enough material to do this whole talk from one collection. While we're at Coniston, up till the mid-1980s, a miniature railway which survived till 2010 in the village, would hold open days once a year for charity. A board was put in the village. We're intrigued, so we go and see what the railway is. Here we see the signal box we saw at the start of the presentation, the Coniston North ground frame, in use as a full-size signal box with a frame, controlling signals. The one in the foreground, an L&W example. The major who is sat on his favourite engine, Josephine, more about later, surveying the scene. And it was a joy to work this railway. The trains were almost an excuse to use the signals because it was block instruments to the other boxes, full-size signalling, and the Major insisted on a record of every movement being kept like a train register today. Here we see the other end of the main line, quarter of a mile away, Boonbeck, his largest engine, and passing another one. This railway is a full talk on itself, which since the closure and lifting and sale of the railway, I have turned into a talk. And where I made my first acquaintance with what later became known as Geoffrey's girlfriend, Josephine, a small 4.4 engine based on the Southeastern and Chatham D-class with a chroma white built brake van. Not suited for the heavy gradients at Coniston, she rarely came out, but when the Coniston Railway book I co-authored was produced, the publisher's Major hosted the launch event at his home and railway, and the publishers request this engine was available, so it just ran a short shuttle. And on to Coniston Station, up a steep hill. Why the station up on the side of the mountain and up a steep hill? It was the Coniston Railway wasn't built for passengers. It was built to get slate and copper ore out. And this was the most convenient route to the top of the hill and also nearer where things needed to be loaded from. 1859 opened, and until the station was demolished, the weather vane had 1859 Coniston Railway on. Sadly, it hasn't survived. Pavilion was provided for refreshments just before the war, and here we see the menu. No Furness Railway all over it, because again, run by the contractors, Spears and Pond. Before the final enlargement of the station in 1896, we have a view, almost certainly 1895. The modernised, for the time, engines, tender engines replaced, rebuilt as tanks in 1891, an old four-wheeler stock, which we can see here. That was considered the branches, all the branches were fit for. Later modernised, as we'll see. We'll see on here two gentlemen that we're going to see in the next slide. Richard Atkinson, the guard in the middle with the beard, and his son Arthur started his railway career just under the chimney, the young lad, as a clerk. He later rose to become the inspector at Barrow Station, and photographs exist of him on Royal Train duties. Father Richard and latterly son Arthur. And Richard's watch still exists with a key with a Furness Railway engine on, but not marked, unfortunately. Coniston Station, after that final rebuild, had a siding and a single platform turned into two platforms, and the archway we saw before widened out, and a push-pull was provided. Here we see the push-pull in its latter days. Coniston Box survived until after the main branch was closed to passengers. Everything gleaming, even at the end, and complete with almost certainly its Furness Railway diagram. Red engines and blue carriages. Haven't we heard that before? Imagine this photograph in colour. A red engine hauling blue carriages. When I used to talk to Major Hext at his home, where the railway was in Coniston, you could see him dreaming back to his boyhood. And this photograph evoked the memories of the red engine, introduced in 1916 to replace the small ones, and the carriages by then in all blue. And he used to tell me he used to ride in the guard's van rather than with his mother, probably in first class, because he used to talk fondly of the branch guard. And a sad scene at Coniston, the start of branch demolition in April 1963. Nothing there remains now, industrial units and housing on the site. The footbridge survived for many years at Ravenglass, but everything usable was removed, even the platform coping stones. As we go down the branch, we pass Tover. The bridge has gone for road improvements, and happily the station survives now as a private house. Woodland, the next station, is now 2 private houses. The frame from Woodland Box went to the Coniston North ground frame, and unfortunately only the box base is still there, but the platforms remain, as does the waiting shelter. And when I was in it nearly 20 years ago, it still had its LMS green and cream paint. Here we see the business end of the push-pull train. And on to Broughton. Again, the station survives as houses, and the yard has been totally built on for housing. And the famous Furness Railway rail motor, an experiment that did not have the success that it did elsewhere. Complaints about its riding, I could talk all night on it, but won't. And we join the main line again at Foxfield, seen here after the station signal box was extended in 1909. The Coniston branch goes off as the first line to the right, and the second line to the right went to a fan of sidings where goods wouldn't normally be handled there, but could be, because the goods yard was on the other side of this island platform. And haven't we heard jokes about the railway? Well, it was still going on in the early 1900s. This magnificent card, published by Synicus, was produced for all over the country. I saw riding cows on the Isle of Wight with the same card on eBay only a couple of weeks ago. But the more you look at it, the more clever you see it is. Railwaymen playing cricket, the passengers pushing, amongst other things. And on to Kirby, where the footbridge from Lindell, after going elsewhere to start with, ended up following a tragic accident where a young lady was killed as she went behind the train on the left-hand line on her way home. She went behind the train, crossed the crossing just off the picture, and a freight train that she couldn't see was coming through the station at speed. So the footbridge, a redundant footbridge, ex-Lindell, was then provided. I'm told it was her 18th birthday. What a tragedy. The station building, built 1904, and the last major station building to be built by the Furness. And the goods sheds were lost when the station platforms were extended in the Second World War. And on to Askham, happily, mostly unchanged. The signal box is still with us. An extension's been put on for welfare facilities, much needed, I know by experience. And the station building, thanks to a preservation order, is still with us, remarkably little changed. And the waiting room in it, thanks to the endeavour of one of the signalmen in the 1990s, is still there as a waiting room. So nice to see. And mineral lines came in serving Askham, the huge ironworks at Askham. Here we see one where the iron ore came from the Lindell area. Direct line into the ironworks because the proprietors didn't like the rates charged by the furnace to bring the iron ore from Lindell round to Askham. So they built their own, the mines built their own line. This road, everything gone, all straightened out onto a wide main road. We go back to 1890s, the mines at Park. Here we see an ex-furnace locomotive, one of 6 tender engines bought by the steelworks, modern 040s but inadequate for the traffic, bought by the steelworks, converted into tanks. This is the first rebuilding into a tank. Later converted again, and 2 of them fortunately survived in children's playgrounds when withdrawn. And one of them happily is with us back to its Furness Railway tender condition as Furness Railway number 20. I'm sure many of you will be acquainted with this magnificent piece of work done by the Furness Railway Trust. But here is one of the 6, we don't know which one, on duty at the iron ore mines as we pass them south of Askham. 500,000 tonnes of ore some years. Again, I could talk all night on the mines served by the railway, but I won't. Park South signal box, still with us, before the bypass was built, destroying the peace of the valley forever. Before then, you could hear the birds singing, but not now with the traffic. Steam specials, 1980s, up to 3 times a week. Acanthus to Sellafield, out and back. And here we see Sir Nigel Gresley on it, passing the crossing. Apart from the bridge dominating the scene and the semaphore replaced by a colour light, hardly changed. Internally, it's been changed. This was taken in the early 1980s when I made my acquaintance with the signalman and was invited in, and it became a regular when he was back shift. I would go and see him and took this internal picture at night. But heavily modernised now, much better welfare facilities, double glazing, false ceilings, good lighting. But the scene as we see it here hardly changed from furnace days, other than the block instruments were the modern British Rail ones replacing the furnace wooden ones. We got back to Barrow with the 1882 built central station. The railways of Barrow again is a topic on its own. We see Copperknob in her caged after she had been withdrawn around 1900, and at that stage the oldest working locomotive in the world, allegedly. Fortunately, the directors kept her, although they cut up her sister, number 4, withdrawn about the same time. And now, of course, one of the treasures of the National Railway Museum, and who kindly let her come to Barrow in 96. The overall roof, quite a size. Magnificent structure, but sadly no longer with us. Here we see the staff, with including a young Arthur Anderson. It's this is a picture taken from the family photo album. And oh dear, 1941, the Luftwaffe paid Barrow quite a few visits, and this was the station mast after a landmine was dropped adjacent. But I understand it only took about 4 days to clear the line and get traffic resuming again. Copperknob's cage was destroyed in the blast. Her chimney is seen on one photograph sticking through the roof. The station was cleared up, basic facilities provided till the 1950s, when the current station in stages was built on the site. And details been changed quite a few times on it, quite a few refurbs of lighting and things, but the station is still remarkably intact from this 1950s building. Very sad night for the furnace. September 1992, the last Whitehaven to Huddersfield postal train ran. A tradition which went back to, we think, 1886 of a postal train on the Furness. The last night going south, absolutely heaving. Plenty of people on the line side and other stations. You couldn't move on the station for it. The mail had already gone by road, but the staff were exhausted posting all the mail. The following morning, 5:30, for the last run with mail going north, only the video cameraman and myself turned out, and I have the last piece of mail franked on the train. So a very sad day, but inevitable, I guess. And we still get bad weather on the Furness. 1994. We had a few days of bad weather, and we nearly got a train snowbound at Bootle, north of here, which is not on our tour today. So the big ploughs had to be sent for. And in all, in my years on the railway, it came out in 1994, I think it was 96 and 2006, when only the smaller ones were needed. But we'd learnt the lessons of this one. You don't try as hard as we want to keep it going. You get the ploughs, get the line clear, and do the job. Might take a bit of delay, but get it running quicker, better. Copper Knob in her case. We leave Barrow to go back to the docks over St. Luke's Junction, which was the junction to go into the dock lines from the north. We saw trains to and from the south at Salthouse, and latter years it just survived for access to the engine shed. These are the lines on the left. Here we see the 1 o'clock express from Barrow going for eventually London Euston, but we join the line back to the docks that in latter years only workmen's trains and freight used. We see the other end of the triangle at Loco Junction and join the line we were on before back to Ramsden Dock. Back over the Schertzer lifting bridge, it looks double track. No, it wasn't. Interlaced track again, with the second track a roadway. The photographer, Michael Andrews, a name some of you may be familiar with, that's his push bike on the left, while he went round doing his invaluable collection of pictures of the Barrow dock lines. Here we see the workman's train taking shipyard workers back home along the chord we just traversed, ending at Millom. Here we see the other workman's train going south to Grange, and in some years Arnside. Apart from more modern rolling stock and a more modern loco, hardly changed from Furness Railway days. The signals have upper quadrant instead of on the mainline signals, instead of the lower quadrant on the branch signal to the left, being the main changes. Where we re-embark our steamer at Ramsden Dock Station, notice the different levels provided for different states of the tide to go back to Fleetwood and on to Blackpool, exhausted. We'll end with the Barrow boat arriving at Fleetwood. This one's the Lady Margaret on a 1905 postcard. And we'll end up taking a quick look at the 6 postcards produced from Furness award-winning posters. Some of the railway magazines, they show these posters and say how the company's won another award. And another magazine actually had a couple in colour. And my favourite one at the end, the Moonlight. The one on the left we can date to almost certainly 1908 because it's announcing the new steam yacht on Coniston, Lady of the Lake, replacing the 1860 built gondola, but she never did replace it because passengers preferred the older vessel. So I must acknowledge, in preparing this talk, permission from the Cumbria Archives and Local History Library to use the Sankey family archive photographs, which are currently being catalogued on a Heritage Lottery project. There are another couple of their photographs used as well. I must thank Mrs. Joan Sankey and her family for preserving this collection when the shop shut and for making it available for the project. And a few other friends whose pictures I've extensively used, and the late Ken Norman, who printed many of the pictures we've seen tonight and taught me to print, allowing me to do many more in the days before scanners, when I used to do my presentations with slides. And of course, we can't forget the many anonymous photographs who took these magnificent photographs many years ago, whose work we enjoy today. And we finish with the crest of the Furness Railway Company. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed it and you enjoyed a taster of the English lakes and the railway that served it.